Poor Mr. Muddle just couldn't get anything right. Everything he did, everything he tried, everything he said was muddled. Totally, utterly, completely and absolutely muddled. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as hammering a nail into a wall. Now, what could get muddled with hammering a nail into a wall? Mr. Muddle could get it muddled, and frequently did. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as putting on your coat. Now, what could get muddled with putting on your coat? Well, see for yourself. Only Mr. Muddle would put his coat on like that. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as going for a walk. Now, what could get muddled about going for a walk? Well, when your legs start walking one way and you start walking the other, that's a very muddly sort of walk. Poor Mr. Muddle, walking one way and going another. Now, you'd probably like to know where Mr. Muddle lives. In a house by the sea near a place called Seatown. Mr. Muddle's house was supposed to be in the country, but Mr. Muddle, who built the house himself, had got the place muddled up, of course. This story starts one afternoon when Mr. Muddle was having his breakfast. Yeah, we know. We know you don't have breakfast in the afternoon. But you do if you get your meal times muddled up. Mr. Muddle was having bread and butter and jam and a cup of tea with milk and sugar. He spread the butter on the table, then spread the jam on the plate, then poured the milk on the bread, and then filled the cup with sugar, and then poured the tea on the bread. What a terribly muddly mixed-up breakfast. That afternoon, after breakfast, he went for a walk down the beach near his house in order to work up an appetite for supper. Met an old fisherman called George, whom he knew quite well. "Afternoon, Mr. Muddle," said George. "Evening," replied Mr. Muddle. George smiled. "How'd you like come fishing with me?" he asked. Oh, no, please," replied Mr. Muddle eagerly. "Help me push the boat out from the beach," called George. "Right-o," said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat further up onto the beach. "Oh, Mr. Muddle," said George, and had to show Mr. Muddle the difference between pulling and pushing. However, eventually, somehow or other, they managed to get the boat out to sea. "Now, let's fish," said George, dropping a fishing line over the side of the boat. "Right-o," said Mr. Muddle, and dropped himself over the side of the boat. "Oh, Mr. Muddle," said George again. It wasn't any good. They didn't catch any fish, so they decided to go home before it became dark. "Help me pull the boat up onto the beach," called George. "Right-o," said Mr. Muddle, and pushed the boat back into the water. George was just about to say, "Oh, Mr. Muddle," again, when he had an idea. Smiled to himself. "Help me push the boat out into the sea," George called. "Right-o," said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat up onto the beach. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," said George. Mr. Muddle smiled a smile and went home. George smiled a smile and went to tell everybody. The following day in Seatown, Mr. Brick, the builder, asked Mr. Muddle to hold his coat for him. "Right-o," said Mr. Muddle, and held his ladder for him, which is what Mr. Brick really wanted. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," smiled Mr. Brick, who'd been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was very pleased. Then Mrs. Scrub at the laundry asked Mr. Muddle to pass her the soap. "Right-o," said Mr. Muddle, and passed her a clothes peg, which is what Mrs. Scrub really wanted. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," smiled Mrs. Scrubb, who'd also been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was extremely pleased. And then Mr. Black, the coalman, asked Mr. Muddle to lift a sack of coal down from his lorry. "Right-ho," said Mr. Muddle, and lifted a sack of coal up onto the lorry, which is what Mr. Black really had wanted all along. "Well done, Mr. Muddle," smiled Mr. Black. George had talked to everybody. Mr. Muddle was delighted. In fact, Mr. Muddle was so delighted that he decided to go home and cook himself a large meal to celebrate. Roast turkey, peas, potatoes, and gravy. He put the turkey in the cupboard to cook. He peeled the peas. He put the potatoes in the refrigerator to boil. And then, do you know what he did? He tried to slice the gravy. "Oh, Mr. Muddle." Mr. Topsy-Turvy was a funny sort of fellow. Everything about him was either upside down or inside out, back to front, topsy-turvy, in fact. It was all very extraordinary. To give you some idea of how topsy-turvy Mr. Topsy-Turvy was, you ought to see his house. The front door is upside down to start with, and the curtains hang upside down at the windows. And just look at that chimney pot. All very extraordinary. Inside is the same. Just look at that clock standing on Mr. Topsy-Turvy's mantelpiece. Isn't that the topsy-turviest clock you've ever seen? And just look at the way Mr. Topsy-Turvy reads a book. Not only does he read it upside down, but he starts to read it at the back page. And just look where Mr. Topsy-Turvy puts the stamp when he sends a letter to somebody. Have you ever seen anything like it? Now, this story is all about the time Mr. Topsy-Turvy came to the town where you and I live. Nobody's quite sure how Mr. Topsy-Turvy got there, or where he came from. But he did arrive because somebody saw him getting off the train. The trouble was, he did it in a topsy-turvy way. Which really isn't all that surprising, is it? Mr. Topsy-Turvy went to a hotel to find a room to spend the night. The hotel manager tried not to smile when he saw Mr. Topsy-Turvy walk into his hotel carrying his suitcase upside down and with his topsy-turvy hat on his head. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "Can I help you?" Now, something you didn't know about Mr. Topsy-Turvy is the way he speaks. You see, he sometimes gets things the wrong way round. "Afternoon good," said Mr. Topsy-Turvy to the hotel manager. I'd room alike." The manager scratched his head. "You mean you'd like a room?" he asked. "Please, yes," replied Mr. Topsy-Turvy. Eventually, the hotel manager managed to work out what Mr. Topsy-Turvy was talking about, and he was taken up in the lift to a bedroom. Then Mr. Topsy-Turvy unpacked a suitcase, put on his pyjamas, and went to bed. He was rather tired after travelling from wherever he'd come from. The following day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy went round the town. But what a fuss his going round the town caused. He took a taxi from the hotel, but so confused the taxi driver trying to tell him where he wanted to go, the poor man drove straight into a traffic light. Oh, dear, said Mr. Topsy-Turvy. I am sorry, very. Then he went into a big department store in the middle of the town. Walked up to one of the counters. I'd like a sock of pears, he said to the lady behind the counter. You mean a pair of socks, she smiled, and showed him a pair of bright red socks. Mr. Topsy-Turvy put them on his hands. Then he tried to leave. But being Mr. Topsy-Turvy, he tried to walk down the up escalator, and all the people who were going up the up escalator all fell over themselves. Oh, it was a terrible topsy-turvy jumble. That day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy did all sorts of topsy-turvy things. Then he went to an art gallery and insisted on hanging all the pictures upside down so that he could look at them properly. And then, after Mr. Topsy-Turvy had been in the town for just one day, he disappeared. Nobody knew how he went, or where he went, but he certainly went because he wasn't there anymore. The whole town breathed a sigh of relief. But what the town discovered, even though Mr. Topsy-Turvy had left, was that everything was still topsy-turvy. Read all it about, shouted the newspaper sellers. Instead of shouting, read all about it. News is the here, said the television newsreader, instead of saying, here is the news. Morning good, people started saying to each other when they met him. Do you how, instead of how do you do? Everybody was talking topsy-turvy. Now, can you think of something to say that's topsy-turvy? Try on, go. I mean, go on, try.